Zoom, 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 zoom. This week in cybersecurity, instead of 5 stories about 5 different topics, we have one big topic. It's about Zoom, the teleconferencing app. Because of shelter-in-place orders around the world, Zoom has become extremely popular and has become a victim of their own popularity and lack of cybersecurity culture. Today, we're going to take a look at that on This Week in Cybersecurity with me, the Code Curmudgeon. Today on This Week in Cybersecurity with the Code Curmudgeon, we're going to talk about a single theme, which isn't something we normally do here. We're still going to have 5 stories, but they're all about the same company. Now, the thing is that with the shelter-in-place orders all over the world, people are working from home more than ever before, and even people who aren't working anymore still need to keep in touch with friends and family. Because of this, the Zoom application has become unbelievably popular. In fact, I use it myself. It's actually a pretty cool application. But Zoom has become a victim of their own popularity. As the massive growth occurs, they're struggling to keep up, but a constant discovery of cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So today I want to look at some of those. I have to say from the outset that while Zoom has not had a culture of security and hasn't put a lot of effort into building security into their software in the first place, they are responding very rapidly and very positively to the challenges that they're currently facing. So let's dive in. First up, it turns out that Zoom is leaking user information. So Zoom has this cool feature that's kind of a directory service. As you sign up for it and you put your corporate email into it, it connects you to other people at the same domain, which is really great because if I'm trying to look up some coworkers, I can quickly get information about them and be able to connect to them, invite them to meetings, etc. So very useful feature. But it turns out they haven't really thought it through with all domains. So with things like your typical work domain, you're probably okay in the sense that they are people that work in your same organization. Sometimes these domain names might be really big, like Microsoft.com, where there are thousands and tens of thousands of engineers, and maybe they don't all need to see everybody's information. But the problem comes from the broader domain names. And the articles here, we're talking in particular about some Dutch domain names. So to put this in simple terms, it's like if you signed up for Zoom with a Gmail and it decided that everybody that had a Gmail worked for the same company, and so they all get linked to the same organization. And this is apparently where the problem is coming in, not for Gmail, but for some domain names that haven't yet been blacklisted. And this is, the nature of blacklist type operations. They're always reactive. Whitelist means you say, these are groups that I know are groups. I've seen these domain names and I'm going to put these people together. Blacklist says, everybody's a group if they have the same thing, unless they match one of these particular criteria. So again, as I mentioned at the outset, Zoom has been responding to this and adding groups to the blacklist. But just be careful. If you're signing up to Zoom with your personal email address, you might not want to put too much private information in there. In fact, you might not anyway. Next up, we're going to talk about Zoom flaws on Macs. It turns out that quite some time ago, many months, Zoom had a problem on the Mac with their little application on the web that starts up the local application. So, like most of these teleconferencing apps, Zoom has a web-based client, but they also have a desktop downloadable component that lets them do more things. And it's pretty cool. It makes things really useful, especially if you're a regular user rather than just a viewer or a participant in a meeting. The trick is that your web browser can't really start applications on the local system because this is a huge security vulnerability. So they build these little helper apps that pop things up in the application by asking you questions. You've probably all seen that if you've taken place with GoToMeeting or Zoom or any other teleconferencing, that you click some link, the link is a URL, the URL takes you to a website which quickly pops up a thing that says, hey, do you want to run this application? Some of them will open up in the web, but a lot of them just say open up in this application and you give it permission. And that's the key, you give it permission. If you skip that step, then potentially you can ultimately start anything that you want through various loopholes. So Zoom had this problem, they fixed it, they tightened down the screws, and it turns out that recently a hacker found some new ways to exploit this thing again. So found ways to take over the webcam, the mic, and give themselves root access, meaning high-level administrative access to the Mac. So Zoom has issued an apology. They've patched these things. There's another patch coming to improve. One of the basic things here is that most of the things we're talking about today have been fixed very rapidly, so just make sure you're keeping your Zoom clients up to date and just keep an eye on what's happening. Well, we talked about Macs, so now let's talk about Windows computers, because they're also not free of Zoom vulnerabilities. Zoom has this cool little chat option where you can talk to other users or type to other users while things are going on, which is very convenient, but you can put things like links in there, which is also very convenient, but it turns out this can be exploited. What happens is that Zoom converts these links that you put in there to what's called UNC, or a Universal Naming Convention. That way, it understands how to interpret the link. And if you click on it, here's the trick. It's supposed to open the link. And what's happening is that the way they implemented this helper application, again, the thing that allows it to do something outside of its normal functionality, which is streaming and teleconferencing, it's leaking information about the user's login name and password, which is really not cool. Not cool at all. So extremely destructive. The password is hashed, but depending on what kind of recovery tools you have, you might be able to reverse engineer it. And it turns out that you might be able to even fire off arbitrary programs or send people to malicious websites and things like that. So I don't think there's a fix out for this one yet, so watch out if you're clicking on links in the Windows client for Zoom. Zoom bombing. It's a great name, isn't it? It sounds frightening as heck. It's kind of like a photo bombing when you go into someone else's photo and you stand at the back and you make a little peace sign, put rabbit ears on somebody. We actually talked about this without the happy phrase Zoom bombing, at least I don't think we did, but we talked about this weeks and weeks and weeks ago. And it turns out that there are lots of ways to just join a Zoom meeting. You can put password protections on these. When they're doing webinars, they typically encourage you to do a sign up and registration, so people have to register it again, although that's no guarantee that they're not going to do something wacky. But in a webinar, they usually can't share their screen anyway and can't talk, so there's not much they can do. But in a regular Zoom session, if you've set it up so that people don't need credentials, then random people can join. And you might think that, hey, this is a weird URL with a weird set of numbers. There are tools out there that help people find these things, and it's pretty easy. And actually, a lot of people there's a shortcut thing, a personal URL that you can do. So, for example, you can do zoom.us/myfunnyname and, put in there whatever you want. And so people can start to guess what your Zoom personal URL is. So there's three basic things you can do in Zoom. One is you can restrict it so that only people with actual Zoom accounts can get in, and this should help a little bit. Another is you can put a password on the meeting, and if you put a reasonable password, you can definitely do it. And hopefully when you're sending out your invite, you can send out your password and hopefully your email is secure. But it's certainly a way to lock it down. It's a little more hassle, but it's definitely more secure. Another way is to implement what they call a waiting room. And in this case, what happens is that people just don't join the meeting automatically. So if you're dealing with small groups of people that maybe a group of friends or a small group of coworkers, it's pretty reasonable because it doesn't put a lot of extra effort onto people. What it means is that when people go to join the meeting, you get, as a meeting organizer, you get a little pop-up that says, hey, here's the people that want to join the meeting, and you can click and admit them to the meeting. And so if you see a name you don't recognize, don't admit them. Again, Zoom's response to this is that they've changed the default settings so that that meeting room is enabled by default now. Probably something they should have done in the first place. And with that in mind, privacy issues. Zoom has definitely been called out for a few things in privacy, and I think we talked about one of these a few weeks ago, but basically people said that they're sharing information with Facebook about what you do and when you do. In fact, I'm sure we talked about this now that I think about it. I guess I should have looked it up, but whatever, right? You're watching here, you're watching now, so there you go. So Zoom is clearly sharing information, and if I'm a private user, maybe I'm not as worried about it, depending on what they're sharing. If they were behaving appropriately, they'd tell me they were sharing, who they're sharing with, what they're sharing, and why they're sharing it, and then I could decide if I'm comfortable with it. As a corporate entity, I certainly don't want Zoom gathering up information about all my employees and sending it somewhere. So one of those things you need to be careful about. There's been a second issue that popped up about end-to-end encryption. Zoom is basically claiming that they do end-to-end encryption, which they absolutely do not do. So let me just make that clear up front. They do use HTTPS, so it's encrypted when I connect. It's encrypted when, the person I'm joining with connects. But they have the keys. They can spy on it. So it's not really end-to-end encryption. It's normal traffic going through their servers, and they can look at it, share it, do whatever they want with it. So just one of those things to keep in mind. That may not be an issue. I don't know, maybe all the services do it this way. I don't know that any of them are really using end-to-end encryption, but it's just one of those things that it's a dual issue. One is end-to-end encryption just isn't a very common thing yet. And number two, organizations are still not very good about telling us what they're doing with our data, what information, how they're storing it, etc. So just one of those things to worry about. There was a funny little story in this about one particular senator who has been fighting for putting back doors into internet applications and to mobile phones and things like that, who's now complaining because Zoom doesn't do true end-to-end encryption. So backdoor is the same kind of a problem. It's not true end-to-end encryption. So that one was just kind of funny and ironic to me. But one of those things today about, privacy. Are we really private? Do we really have protection everywhere we go? We've come to the end, so thumbs up if you liked it. I guess thumbs down if you hated it. Leave me some messages. Hey, share it with your friends. Let them know that we're doing this thing every week. 5 interesting stories about cybersecurity. And if there's some stories you think are interesting you'd like me to cover, please let me know. If there's a theme, it might be fun to do another week with a bunch of themes. And basically, keep yourself safe and secure out there, everyone.